Hello DSci 2000, welcome to Unit 2. In this unit, I will be covering what I call the data workflow. In this video, I'm going to show you how to write your first R program. Here's the usual objective slide. Please pause and read before proceeding. So beginning this video, lectures are going to be a lot more interactive. I'll mention references in the slides as necessary, but I won't be reading off of the slides as much as I did in prior lectures. My aim in this lecture is just to show you what a data workflow looks like in the jobs I've had where I've used R. So let's just go ahead and get started on this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a folder specifically for DSci 2000. And this can be anywhere, just make sure you know where it is so you can access it. I'm going to click this folder. And this is the one folder that you will be using throughout the entire semester that will contain all of your lecture notes and homework assignments, and which you will eventually submit to GitLab. In this lecture, we're going to cover what you need in this folder. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up RStudio. And once RStudio is open, I'm going to put in that folder what is known as an R project. Here's how you initialize an R project. I'm going to go to File here on the top left corner, and then go to New Project. This will open up a dialog box, and I will click Existing Directory. And then I'm going to browse to that one folder that I just created for DSci 2000. And once I'm in that folder, I'm going to click Open, and I'm going to click Create Project. So what has this done? If I look in the DSci 2000 folder, this has created what is known as an R project file for DSci 2000. R project files have this blue icon right here, and they have this extension rproj. So I will often refer to R project files as simply rproj files. So we've created an rproj file inside this DSci 2000 folder. In addition, just so you are aware, in RStudio, at the top right over here, we have again that blue R project icon with DSci 2000 right next to it. This indicates here that the DSci 2000 rproj file has been opened. Now you might be wondering to yourself, why do we need an R project file, and why can't we just begin coding immediately? The reason for that is this, and this is in slide 4 of the slides I provided you. The reason for that is because later on in the semester, we'll be reading data from external files. And the only way that R will know where to search for files is by searching in what is known as the working directory. For every other programming language I've worked with outside of R, the working directory is usually where the code is located, which makes sense. For R, that isn't necessarily the case. So for R, we have to perform this extra step of figuring out how to set the working directory to a spot that makes sense. And that is the purpose of the R project. What I mean by that is this. If I open up this DSci 2000 folder, and I open up the rproj file right here, what R will do is it will automatically assume that the working directory is located where this rproj file is located, which is the DSci 2000 folder, which makes sense because we will want to put files here in the future, and we will want to tell R, search here for the files. This will be more clear as you see more examples of this. In addition, with the R project, under the console, you can see here that it indicates specifically that that DSci 2000 folder is exactly where the working directory is located. Whatever is under the console tells you where R will assume the working directory is located, which is where it will assume that you are reading files from. Some of you might be familiar with R already, and you might want to use the setwd function to set the working directory instead of an R project. My advice is please don't use this function. In about 99.9% of situations I've been in, the setwd function is usually inappropriate. Please don't use it, and please use R projects to set your working directory. So let's talk about what needs to be in this folder. In this folder, you're going to have an rproj file. In addition, for every single unit for which you're taking notes, and for homework assignments, I'm expecting you to build subfolders within this folder. So for example here, we're talking about Unit 2, So I'm going to create a new folder here and just call it Unit 2. And whatever is in the Unit 2 folder should, of course, be relevant to Unit 2. I also expect you to make separate subfolders for homework assignments. So for example, for homework 3, if homework 3 is a coding assignment, I expect you to create another folder in here called homework 3 so I can easily figure out where your homework 3 code exists. So we've created this Unit 2 folder, and what we're going to do next is we're going to put code into this folder. To create new code in RStudio, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File again. I'm going to go to New File and then RScript. And what this does is it creates a text file in the top left corner right here. This is where you will be writing your code and testing it. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to copy and paste into this area in the top left over here the code that I've provided you from D2L. There are 3 code files, whether you're using a Mac, a Windows with admin rights, or Windows without admin rights. Please choose the appropriate code file and copy and paste it into here. So here I have opened the Windows with admin rights file. I'm going to select all using Control A or Command A if you are on a Mac, then copy. I'm going to click on Untitled 1 right here and then paste. Observe here that Untitled 1 is in red. That is how RStudio indicates that that code file has not been saved yet. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to save it. I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to open up the Unit 2 folder I just created, and I'm just going to give this a name. I'll just call this code.r. So now I have the code installed. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to run this code. I'm going to hit Control A to select all, and then Control Enter. And what pops up right here is a dialog box asking me for my DSci 2000 database username. In an email, you should have received a username and password for accessing the DSci 2000 database. Please input it in here. And then another dialog box will appear asking you for your DSci 2000 database password. Please put in your password and then press OK. Now some of you will inevitably put in your credentials incorrectly. Just follow the same process again of selecting all the code and running it. If you run into any problems, please let me know as soon as possible. Observe what's happened here. We selected the code and then we ran it. All code is run in the console in the bottom left over here. This is how R processes code. In most other programming languages, how code is usually executed is you take the code as a text file and then you process it through a compiler and then it's all executed at once. R does not work that way. In fact, how R works is it executes code line by line. So it is not compiled like Python or Java or C or C++. We'll get into the technical aspects of that later, but the one thing I want to point out is this. Toward the top right over here, we see that there's now this data frame df that has appeared. If you want to see df's contents, you can see there's an arrow right next to it. We can click on the text df itself, not the arrow, but the text next to it. And what this will do is in the top left window, it will show us the contents of that particular table. So we can see that df has 2 columns, ID and city, with IDs and city names. And we can scroll through this table and see exactly what's in here. So this is a 1,000 row table with 2 variables. So 1,000 rows and 2 columns. The next thing I want to mention is that this process I displayed to you here is exactly how I will be testing your code. What we did here was we opened up a fresh session of RStudio, and then we selected all, and then I ran the code using Control Enter. This is how I will be testing to make sure your code works. So the first step is you have to have a fresh RStudio session, which you can obtain in one of 2 ways. You can just close and reopen RStudio, or if you want, you can also go to Session and restart R. And then in addition to that, you'll want to click this brush right here and click yes to clear the workspace. There are two ways you can create a fresh session in RStudio, either by closing and reopening RStudio, or by going to Session, Restart R, and then clearing the workspace using that brush I just showed you. And then what I will do is I will just press Control A and then Control Enter to make sure your code works. That is how I will test your code in this class. So now let's dive in and explain what these lines of code are doing. This will slightly differ among the three versions of code that I have on D2L, but the functionality is identical. So I mentioned here that we're installing these packages. Packages in R consist of functions and other objects that you can run in your code to make your life easier. For instance, here in line 2, I am installing the RODBC and the RStudio API packages. And in lines 5 and 6, I am loading these packages into my code. Loading of packages is done using the library function. You cannot load a package until you've installed it. In addition to this, installation only needs to be done the first time you are running a package. So I can in fact just comment out line 2 because I won't need to execute anymore by throwing a pound sign to the left of it. So what have I done here so far? We've installed these two packages, RODBC and RStudio API, and then we've loaded them right here. You might be wondering what the purpose of these packages might be. The purpose of the RODBC package is to set up R to an ODBC connection. I had you set up an ODBC connection on your own to the SQL database. So the RODBC package provides functions that let you use R to interact with any ODBC connections that you have set up in your computer. The RStudio API package, what that does is it creates the dialog boxes that ask you for your username and password. And if I were to scroll down a bit, lines 9 and 10 are what create the dialog boxes asking you for your username and password. Show prompt and ask for password are functions that come from the RStudio API package. If you want to learn more about those functions, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. What you can do is once you've loaded a package using library, if I want to say, for example, find out about the show prompt in the console in the bottom left right here, what I can do is I can type in $show prompt, and I can press tab to autocomplete. I'm going to press enter, and what this will do is on the bottom right, it will provide me R's documentation about that function. This is the show prompt function in the RStudio API package. It describes to me what this function is doing, as well as the arguments of the function and what they are. So for example, in the situation in our code, I have put two arguments into show prompt, both of them being strings. The first one being username, and the second one being enter your DSci 2000 database username. If I were to look at the documentation in the bottom right here, the first argument is the title. This is the title that's in the dialog box. And the second argument is the message. And it says here that it's a character, or the string, with contents to display in the main dialog area. To see how these relate, I'm just going to run this one line of code. You don't have to do this. With Control Enter. And you can see that here's the title, and here's the message that's associated in here. In addition to this, we can see that after I typed in my username into that dialog box, that at the top right, it now says that the value of UID is the Miller-YE string. Why this is happening is because of line 9 right here. Show prompt is prompting the user for a string. And what's happening is that the output of the show prompt function is being assigned to the UID variable. So this is how variable assignment is working in R. The assignment operator in R is this arrow with a less than sign and a hyphen. In most other programming languages, it's usually an equal sign, but R is unique in this sense, in that it has a different assignment operator. In line 10, ask for password, as you might recall from earlier in this lecture, puts up another dialog box asking for the password. And the output of that is being assigned to the PWD variable. So both of these variables, UID and PWD, are outputs of functions coming from RStudio API, which is what generates the dialog boxes asking for you for your username and your password. Next, I'd like to discuss lines 11 through 15 right here. You might recall that I had you set up an ODBC connection to DSci2000_prod. This is actually how you connect R to the ODBC connection whose name is DSci2000prod. It's using your username and password to get through there. The rows at time and believe end rows are just additional options that are required when you are running a SQL Server database, and I won't go into detail on those. So in essence, what is happening here is that R is using this ODBC connect function to start the ODBC connection to DSci2000prod, and this is being assigned to a variable channel. The channel right here is just a placeholder indicating the connection that you've made to your database. So in essence, all these 5 lines are doing is that it's just beginning a connection to your database via channel. Then once you've begun the connection to your database using channel, you can remove your credentials. It's always a good idea to make sure that you just remove your credentials when you no longer need them. We don't need them anymore because we've already initialized the connection. And then down here, what we've done is we've run a SQL query to pull the contents of that table, i.e. a 2-column table with the IDs and the cities. You will understand what this code means later, but you might recognize this from what I asked you to do in Azure Data Studio and SQL Server Management Studio. The output of this SQL query is then thrown into the df variable, which makes sense because we saw from viewing the contents of df that it has the contents of that table. Then once we have finished pulling the data from the SQL table, we close the connection because we don't need it anymore using ODBC close, and then we remove the connection from R's memory. So this is what a basic data workflow looks like. You make sure your packages are installed, you load the packages, you put in your credentials, your username and password, you set up a connection using ODBC Connect, you delete your credentials from memory, you run a SQL query to pull the data that you want, then you close your SQL connection using ODBC close, and then you remove the connection from memory because you no longer need to pull additional data using your SQL connection. In the slides, I describe how you can use a function from a package without loading the entire package using the library function. I will let you read this slide on your own. Please note that ODBC close will close the SQL connection, and RM will remove the connection from the R global environment, freeing it from memory. Make sure you understand that the functions of ODBC close and RM are completely different. If I use RM on channel, it will not close the connection. It will just remove it from memory and have the connection still straying. You must close a connection using ODBC close when you are done with it, and then you must remove it from memory using RM. In the slides, I also mentioned that instead of ODBC close to close an ODBC connection, you could also use ODBC close all just to close all of them. This is especially useful if you're connecting to multiple databases, which I won't be covering in this class, but you should note this for your reference. One last item of practical concern. Please do not store your credentials in your code. I have had really unfortunate experiences with this in the past, and I have had IT directors yell at me because of this. There is a reason why I have you input your credentials through user dialog boxes. It's so that you're not storing your credentials directly in the code. That is a massive security problem that will have IT directors yelling at you. Now the last thing I want to do is notice here again that I haven't saved the code yet because it's still in red. So I'm going to press Ctrl S just to save this. And now I'm going to close up RStudio. So I'm going to press X over here. And notice that it asked me if I want to save this workspace image. Let me explain to you what this is saying. The workspace refers to all of these variables that are currently existing in your RStudio session, namely the DF and the UID. So it's basically asking, do you want R to keep a record of what you've left in here? My advice to you is that when you see a message from RStudio asking you if you want to save a workspace image, please hit don't save. That will save you a lot of pain later. The reason why you want to do this is because If you do end up saving it, what it will do is it will just store all of those variables in your workspace into your folder. And most of the time that is unnecessary. And that will also not help for me to test out your code because I will not have your workspace image available. I will be running your code from scratch with just your code file. So you should get into the habit of when it asks you whether or not you want to save your workspace image to just hit don't save. And that ends this lecture.